and welcome to the 2025 Back to School webinar from Disability Rights Texas. I'm Edie Surtees, and I'm the Communications Director here at Disability Rights Texas. I just thank you for being here today. I'll be moderating our session today, and our session will be presented by two of our wonderful special education experts, Stephen Aleman, who is an education policy specialist for us. Hi, Stephen. And Maia Volk, who is our our mental health policy fellow. So they'll be speaking in just a moment. Before I turn it over to them, I just wanted to go over just a few things about today's session. Laurel, if you could change that. Thank you. So today's presentation will be 50 minutes, so it's going to go pretty fast. It'll be jam-packed, full of information. We will have a time for questions and answers at the end, 10 minutes at the end. So we know that's not a lot, but hopefully we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, and you will see the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen in the menu, the Zoom menu. It says Q&A and it has a question mark. Also, wanted to let everybody know that ASL is provided. Do we see that our ASL interpreter is on, Laurel?
They're on.
Yeah. Yes. I see Kylie there, so good deal. And we have Jenny as well. So welcome to our ASL interpreters. We also want to remind people that you can turn on captions. To do that, look at the menu at the bottom and look for something that says show captions. And I'm trying to see. And then I don't see that on show captions and click on the CC icon. And Josh has put those instructions in the chat as well as you will see them on our screen. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll turn it over to Stephen and Maia.
Hi, everyone. I think we've had a few more folks pop in since it turned 12, so I'll introduce myself again. My name is Maia Volk. I'm the Mental Health Policy Fellow at Disability Rights Texas, and I'm co-facilitating today with Stephen Aleman, our Senior Policy Specialist for Education at DRTX. So before we dig into the policies that were passed this session, just an introduction. The 89th legislature ran from January 14th to June 2nd of 2025. And so far, Governor Abbott, since the end of the regular session, has called 2 special sessions in this summer of 2025. And there was one education-related call for both of those special sessions related to STAR testing and accountability. And actually, as of now, HB 8 in the second special session did pass. So that was the STAR testing reform. Next slide. I'll also share, if you're not aware of this resource yet, Texas Legislature Online is the official website for the Texas Legislature. And on TLO, you can find bills, committees, hearings, lawmakers, all the other information you might need about the regular session and the special sessions. Next slide. So this past session was a very big session for education. There were a lot of bills filed, a lot of bills passed, and as Stephen and I were analyzing these bills, we found that the special education related bills fell into 6 categories. So there were special education funding and policy changes, there were education savings accounts, behavior, discipline, and safety, transition planning, student-focused policy and program changes, and agency-focused policy and program changes to our education policy this session. And we'll go through the bills in each of those categories in more detail today. Just another note, a lot of bills were filed in the regular session. We're only going to be speaking about legislation that passed, that made it across the finish line, and is going to be in effect now or in the future. So with that, I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Maya. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start with the first category of legislation affecting special education and students with disabilities that Maya described, what we're calling just general special education funding and policy reform legislation. Two big bills to highlight, starting with our recap of the 89th legislative session. These two bills are SB 568 and House Bill 2. These were comprehensive special education reform bills. Now, what's unique about these two pieces of legislation is that they are very interconnected. SB 568 was an exclusive special education bill, and House Bill 2 incorporated many other big topics connected to public education, many of which you probably heard in the news about teacher salaries and other public education issues. But HB 2 did incorporate, at the end of the day, Senate Bill 568 as well. So next slide, please. To sort of try to illustrate this relationship between House Bill 2 and SB 568, this is somewhat of a unique outcome. It turns out that HB 2 totally encompasses the content of Senate Bill 568, but there's still some portions of House Bill 2 that were not in SB 568 that are freestanding in HB 2. All that to say that when we go forward with the description of the two bills, know that everything that we're describing is in HB 2, but because SB 568 was more of the specific special ed bill, we're going to describe the changes that were enacted by way of SB 568. Next slide, please. So what happened in SB 568? Now here we have two portions of legislation that we want to describe. Those that were related to the financial side of special education system in Texas and the special education policy side. We're going to start with the financial components of SB 568. The most important thing that happened here is a revamp of our state special education allotment formula. The state, over the past 30 years, has been funding special education services in Texas based upon what we call a placement-based formula. There has been grumblings over the last several years and special legislative sessions as well that this old 30-year formula should be changed and updated. And we provide some of the references here to policy commissions and committees that made recommendations. Next slide, please. Those recommendations ultimately culminated in Senate Bill 568 with changes to our state special education funding formula. In short, we are moving from a placement-based system to a service intensity model, meaning that funding will have a gradation based upon how much and how intense special ed services are for a student with a disability, rather than the place where they are being served. There are going to be different tiers where, in total 8 tiers, where funding will progressively increase. The relationship between each tiers will be differentiated based upon multiple elements, including the type of special education services being provided, and the frequency and nature of those services, the personnel required to deliver those special education services in terms of their certifications and licensures, as well as other elements connected to the fidelity of special ed services, such as recommended ratios of staff to students, as well as other elements of what is necessary to deliver those special ed services by way of equipment and support technology. So needless to say, the service intensity tiers, as they will be known, will be connected to one another in a gradation process or a series of step-ups, leading to school districts receiving more support when the student gets more of special education services. And this seems to be a much more logical way of delivering state aid to school districts to support students with disabilities, again, rather than just based upon where that student is. Next slide, please. Now, there is another element to the system, and given the complexity to all of this, we want to emphasize that these changes will not start this fall. As Maia noted, a lot of the legislation that we're covering today is already in effect with the start of the 2025-2026 school year. But in this case, the changes to the formula funding by the state are so complex that they are being delayed by one school year to allow the Texas Education Agency, or TEA, the ability to exercise the authority that's been granted them by the legislature to determine all the details of the service intensity formula. But one thing to note as we talk about these big financial changes of state support for special ed is that the Senate Bill 568 does mandate that the state does increase its state spending on special education by a minimum of $250 million in the coming school year. That is the 26-27 school year compared to this current school year. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, Senate Bill 568 and HB2 are related, and they had both financial components to them and policy components related to them. We're going to shift gears from the financial part to the policy part. One of the most important things that is the policy reforms in HB2 relates to our state requirements around physical restraints of students with disabilities. There are some big changes in HB2 connected to what training will be required of school staff members on crisis prevention and intervention. So what is crisis prevention and intervention? It's based upon evidence-based strategies and practices to eliminate or reduce emergencies or crisis situations that might develop into a physical restraint. The notion here is that school staff should be better equipped to recognize and respond to crises so that alternative means can be employed by staff, avoiding the use of physical restraint as much as possible. One of the key aspects of this reform that's embedded in HB2 is that school districts will be required to prioritize crisis prevention and intervention training based upon the staff members' quote risk of being involved in a crisis situation. In other words, students, for instance, who have behavioral needs that might tend to lead to a crisis, their teachers and paraprofessionals will be at the front of the line to get new crisis prevention and intervention training. Whereas perhaps if you have a regular education teacher that has an inclusion model with a co-facilitating special ed teacher, they might be back of the line in terms of this crisis prevention and intervention training because they're not as much at risk of being exposed to a student who might be in crisis. Of course, we would recommend this training to be utilized and given to all staff members in school districts. But the reality is, and we recognize and support HB2 saying that certain staff members should be recognized and identified as needing this training in a priority basis. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's a very quick recap of House Bill 2 and SB 568. Believe me, there's a lot more content in those bills than I've covered, but in the interest of time, we're moving on to our next topic area of education savings accounts. Now, Senate Bill 2 passed during the regular session is the education savings account legislation. And it's important to point out, first of all, that this program will not be operated by the Texas Education Agency, our State Department of Education. Instead, the legislature picked the Texas Controller of Public Accounts as the government agency that will be running this program. Now, of course, TEA will have a role in supporting the Controller's Office, especially with regard to the participation of students with disabilities, but know that really any questions and policy decisions will end up being addressed by the Controller's Office. And again, similar to the formula changes enacted by SB 568, whenever you have such a big change in policy or launching a new big program, there's a delay in implementation. And again, here, ESAs are not available this school year. They won't become available until the 2026-27 school year. Next slide. Now, with regard to the ESA program and students with disabilities, again, as Maya said, we've spent a lot of time analyzing this legislation and all the other bills and trying to break out dimensions of the legislation to highlight. And for the ESA bill, SB2, we've identified several elements that do have some specific mention or relevance to students with disabilities. But in the interest of time, we're just going to focus on a couple of these. Next slide, please. The first is with regard to students who are going to be participating and recognized as a student with a disability. It's important to note at the outset about the ESA program is that their meaning of a child with a disability is different than in the public school system. In the public school system, you may have a child with a disability with a Section 504 plan rather than an IEP under federal law known as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Here in SB2, a child with a disability means that they qualify for special ed services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that's an important distinction to note at the outset about SB2. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to giving priority access to the program, lawmakers anticipate that there will be more demand for an ESA account than the number of accounts that can be available due to funding. So they have established already a lottery system to give preference to students. And there are going to be 3 different groups that are given a preference of access to the ESA program. Next slide, please. With regard to children who are children with a disability, there is a preference for them to the extent that they are members of a household whose total annual income is at least 500% or below of the federal poverty guidelines. So be mindful of that in terms of family income and whether or not you get preference for access to the program. And to be clear, that's not an eligibility standard. That is just with regard to the lottery preference of getting access to an account for a child with a disability and then the nature of their family's financial situation. Next slide. Now, perhaps the more important question that comes to mind is, well, how much will be in my ESA account? Again, the structure of an ESA program is that there will be a quote, an account for each participating student, and families will not receive direct payments and have money to be reimbursed or to spend. Rather, they will get access to an account which the state will directly disperse to your private school or private provider. Now, in terms of what will be in the account, in terms of the funding level, for students with disabilities, it's important to note that there will be more money in their accounts as opposed to other, quote, regular participants. They will get the base amount plus an additional amount based upon the amount of state funding that that student would have generated had they been in public school receiving special ed services. And again, we just recapped the new formula that will end up being a part of that calculation next school year and going forward. But be aware that regardless of how much state aid would have flowed to a school district to support that particular student. There is a cap or limit for the ESA account funding of $30,000 combined of your base amount, as well as your supplemental special ed funding allotment amount. So again, it is going to be a little bit complicated to know how much a student with a disability is going to get in their ESA account. You have to be in the program first. No one's going to give you an estimate to even have a ballpark of what would be available. You have to get into the program first, and then the program will calculate that amount for you. And I think that brings us to one last slide for me, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Maia in the interest of time. And this is just one other aspect of getting to determining that you're a student with a disability. The law does provide that you can go to your local school district if you've never been in public school to get what we call a full individual initial evaluation, or FIIE. When you have that, the school district will use that to propose an individualized education program, or IEP, with the understanding you're not coming to public school, but that document is for purposes of calculating that special ed funding aspect of the ESA account. So again, there's going to be several steps for a student with a disability to participate in the ESA program, particularly if they've never been to public school before. And so again, all of this will be playing out and getting set up in the next school year, or this current school year for next school year. So there'll be plenty of time to get into a lot of the details and operations of this program. Just one final slide for me now, which is, and we'll just go ahead and skip to the next slide, please, in the interest of time for Maia, that there is a website that's been set up on the, or page on the website of the Controller Public Accounts, for you to get more information. And that is there on the screen, and you can also Google that to get access to it. Controller Public Accounts ESA website. And with that, in the interest of time, I'm going to stop and pass it back to Maia.
Thank you. So this regular session also saw a lot of big changes to Chapter 37 of the Education Code on discipline. And the main vehicle for these changes was HB 6 by Representative Leach. So one big component of HB 6 was that it expanded teacher removals. So prior to this school year, this bill is effective as of now for this school year. Prior to this school year, teachers could only remove students if their behavior was documented to repeatedly interfere or was determined to be so unruly, disruptive, or abusive that it seriously interfered with the teacher's ability to communicate. Starting this school year, teachers may now remove a student from the classroom for a single instance of interference, bullying, and behavior that is unruly, disruptive, or abusive. So something I think that is important for families of students with disabilities to be aware of and be diligent of is that their child's behaviors related to their disability is not misinterpreted and disciplined, especially at the beginning of the school year, as students might be getting to know new teachers for the first time. Next slide. So once a student has been removed from the classroom by a teacher, the school will notify the family and a conference will be held within 3 school days. So a student may not return to class without the written consent from their teacher or a return to class plan. I think it's probably going to be more common that students will need a return to class plan to return to the classroom. And this plan will be drafted either before or at that conference that's held within 3 school days. A student can appeal their removal to the school's placement review committee or the campus's threat assessment team. It's important to note that students with disabilities cannot appeal their removals to their ARD committee, their admission review and dismissal committee. It has to be one of either the school's placement review committee or the campus's threat assessment team. Next slide. Another big component of HB 6 was the expansion of in-school suspension. So previously, in-school suspension was limited to 3 school days. Now in-school suspension is unlimited. However, a school administrator will review a student's placement in ISS in-school suspension at least every 10 school days. And something else that's important to note for students with disabilities is that this administrator review does not count as a manifestation determination review. Next slide. So students that are placed in ISS under HB 6 are now entitled to receive comparable services. And for students with disabilities, this includes services specified in their IEPs. So for the purposes of a change in placement, so if a student is removed from the classroom in what's considered a change in placement for over 10 days, they have to undergo that manifestation determination review to make sure that they're not being punished for manifestations of their disabilities. Under this new requirement for in-school suspension of comparable services, it's still possible that ISS can be considered a change in placement. So if the student is participating with non-disabled peers in ISS to the extent that they would have in their regular placement, then if they are getting comparable services, that would not be considered a change in placement. But if, let's say, they're the only student in school suspension, or there's only a few other students and they have disabilities, and that student would have otherwise been participating with students without disabilities in their regular placement, then that would constitute a change in placement. Next slide. There were also changes to out-of-school suspension. So students below grade 3 can now be placed in out-of-school suspension if their conduct threatens the immediate health and safety of other students, or if there's documented conduct that results in repeated or significant disruption to the classroom. And out-of-school suspension is limited to a 3-day maximum. HB 6 introduces a mechanism for students to be moved from out-of-school suspension to in-school suspension if the parent submits a written request to a school administrator with supporting documentation that they are unable to provide suitable supervision at home during those school hours. Next slide. And then lastly, on HB 6, they introduced a new virtual expulsion program designed for students who would otherwise be expelled. So administrators can now place students under a virtual expulsion program to provide virtual instruction and instructional materials for remote learning only if there is no available juvenile justice alternative education program placement available, or JJAP. So the school is required to ensure that the student has a suitable computer and internet connection in order to be able to participate in this virtual education program. And a school administrator will review a student's placement at least once every 45 school days. So something else that's important to note is that students with disabilities are entitled to the services outlined in their IEP, even if they are expelled. And some of those services might be suitable for online administration, but some of those services might not be able to be given online. So that's another thing that parents should be aware of. Next slide. And so now I'm going to transition to another bill, HB 121 by Representative King, which was the school safety cleanup bill. There's a lot of different aspects of this bill, but I'm just going to focus on one section that's relevant to students with disabilities. So under HB 121, when a student with a disability is undergoing a threat assessment, the team conducting that assessment must include one of the following professionals who has specific knowledge of that student's disability. So either a SPED teacher that provides instruction to that student, a licensed behavior analyst, a licensed clinical or master social worker, or a licensed school psychologist. HB 6 does have similar language to this. Under HB 6, the added team member has to have knowledge of disability manifestations generally, but under HB 121, that added team member has to have knowledge of that specific student's disability and its manifestations. So the language in HB 121 is slightly more specific, and we'll be monitoring how it's implemented in rulemaking, but since it is more specific, this is likely the version that is going to be followed. Next slide. So under safety, we have SB 57 by Senator Zaffarini on safety planning for students with disabilities in drills or emergencies. And this bill requires the commissioner to establish recommendations for accommodations for students with disabilities during drills and emergency situations, and instructs school safety and security committees to include a SPED administrator on their team and includes accommodations for students with disabilities in their multi-hazard emergency operation plans. Next slide. And now I'll just talk about one bill under transition planning. The Caitlin Handley Act, HB 1188 by Representative Manuel, mandates that during a ARD committee hearing where a student with a disability would be, sorry, let me start over. School districts will provide parents and guardians with information about services and benefits provided by their local IDD authority at the first ARD committee hearing for a student with an intellectual developmental disability. And TEA and HHSC will collaborate together to make those informational materials that will be shared. Next slide. And I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Maya. Again, we're progressing through our different categories of bills as they relate to special education and students with disabilities. So now we've reached the portion of bills that we've identified, at least, as student-focused policy changes. And we want to highlight a couple of bills here. And I want to point out, first of all, that House Bill 1481 is not a special education bill per se, but it is a generally applicable new piece of law. But there are some very important elements for students with disabilities that we want to highlight. So first of all, what is House Bill 1481? This is what's commonly being called the cell phone ban bill. This is new legislation that's now in effect that says that students cannot have a personal communication device. And there is a definition of personal communication device in the law itself. Now, what the law requires is that for every school district or charter school included, to have a new policy that says that students are prohibited from using a personal communication device during the school day. Now, here's the part that's important for today's webinar. There are some very important exceptions to that broad mandate that cell phones be banned in public schools. And these relate to, first of all, whether or not the student is a student with a disability with either an IEP or a Section 504 plan, and that plan says something about the student having to have access to a personal communication device. So again, going back to an earlier reference to students with disabilities, in the context of HB 1481, This is applicable to both students protected by Section 504 and students protected by IDEA. Again, if their IEP or 504 plan says something about a personal communication device, the school cannot ban the student from having that device. So the details of the plan and what the IEP says is very critical here. The next exception to the general ban on cell phones is if the student produces a document from a qualified physician that says that the student has a need and must have access to the personal communication device during the school day. Now here, think about students who might need certain monitoring for disability connected or health connected reasons. And they have a written note from their doctor. The third exception is if for some reason having access to a personal communication device is needed to comply with either local or state health or safety requirements. Bottom line is know that the cell phone ban bill is not 100%, that there are carve-outs for students with disabilities and other students who have either a doctor's note or there's some reference to a personal communication device in the IEP or 504 plan. Just one final note on this piece of legislation. Administrators should not unilaterally be acting about telling a student they cannot have the device or it's okay for them to have the device. It's got to come through that committee process of either an ARD committee or Section 504 team meeting. Okay, next slide. A couple of other bills we just want to highlight very quickly. Again, general bills would have some dimension to them for students with disabilities. One is Senate Bill 2398 with regard to students with traumatic brain injuries. This would supplement what school districts are doing for students with TBI, as its condition is known. There will be coming more guidance about how to respond to students with TBI from TEA. The other bill we want to highlight is Senate Bill 569. Senate Bill 569 is about virtual schools, online schools. There's now a specific provision in law that says that the virtual or hybrid courses must be able to meet the needs of students with disabilities as required under either IDEA or Section 504. So again, note that if you are in an online situation, a virtual situation, you have new protections to ensure that you get access to special education and accommodations as a participating student. Okay, so let's change gears to our last category. And we're getting close to wrapping up, maybe a little bit early. We'll have plenty of time for questions. And I see that we have already over a dozen questions at least. So we're going to have time for that. Just a couple other bills to note is with regard to the first one is House Bill 2310. This has to do with having a state plan for early learning of children with disabilities. And this is a strategic plan that will be coming next year, in less than a year now. It's due September 1, 2026. If you have an interest in this topic, be watching for public meetings around a new strategic plan for young children with disabilities. Next slide, please. Just a couple of other key agency-focused level legislation. Senate Bill 1952 has to do with a state program called SHARS, School Health and Related Services Program, or SHARS. And this bill clarifies the administrative structure at the state level between HHSC, the Health and Human Services Commission, and TEA. And this clarity is needed because the state got in trouble from the federal government in its administration of SHARS. In short, SHARS is another funding mechanism for schools for students with disabilities when they provide medically connected services to a student with a disability. And now we're going to have a little bit more clarity about how the state administers the SHARS program. And finally, I'll note Bill HB 2598, which has to do with some of the professionals in the public school system that serve students with disabilities. There's been a formal change in their legal title. You may be familiar with the acronym LSSP, which stands for Licensed Specialist in School Psychology. You often see LSSPs doing evaluations or attending ARD meetings. Well, now the law has simply updated and simplified their title to school psychologist. Okay, with that, we have done a quick run through of the 6 categories that Maia and I identified as legislation out of the 89th legislature connected to students with disabilities and special education. And now we're going to wind down with just a couple other bits of information and then get to your questions.
So what's next for the interim after the 89th regular session? School districts and charter schools are going to prepare for the implementation of these new laws, some which are already effective and some which will be effective in the coming school years. TEA will also be updating their regulations and creating new rules to implement these laws, and launch the new special education funding system as well as other rulemaking. And the Comptroller of Public Accounts has already begun their rulemaking for the new Education Savings Account program. Next slide. The 90th legislature will begin on January 12th, 2027. Before then, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and the Speaker of the House will announce their interim study charges to committee chairs, and then the House and Senate committees will hold their hearings to study these charges and issue their recommendations via their reports by the end of 2026. Also, the Sunset Advisory Commission will begin their review of relevant state agencies up for review in 2026 for consideration by the 90th legislature. You can see a list of those state agencies that are under review on their website. So with that, I think we are ready for questions.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you, Stephen and Maia, for providing so much information and how you've organized it and thought it out. And we know there is a lot more, but you've really summarized it well for us. Thank you so much. Yes, now we will answer questions. And Stephen, even though we finished the presentation portion a little early, I just will let you know we now have 22 questions. So I don't know if we'll get to everything, but we are certainly going to try to get to as many as possible. And we are going to make note of the ones we don't answer and try to send the answers to you as well. So just know that if what I'm going to do right now is try to kind of pick something in different categories as much as I can. And please know that if we don't answer your question, that we will answer it in another way. So first, there was a question back at the beginning on HB 6, says about, I'm wondering if I should, can y'all, Maia and Stephen, can you see the Q&A?
Yes.
Because some of these questions are rather lengthy. I can also put them in the chat, though. That's probably what I'll do, is put them in the chat.
Perfect.
So let's see, everyone. So the question, I put it in the chat, but what's the timeline for threat assessment process to start for eligible incidents? And further, can this happen after a lone campus behavior coordinator has already decided on DAEP placement?
So
yeah.
Yeah. I could take a stab at this question and then Stephen can fill in any gaps I might miss. But threat assessments are designed to review reported threats that would put student and staff safety at risk. And so once there's a reported threat, a threat assessment would start immediately. A manifestation determination review, or MDR, is something that's triggered when a student with a disability has had a change in placement for 10 days. And this is a review to make sure that the behavior in question is not a manifestation of a disability. And if it is a manifestation of a disability, that student is not punished for that behavior. So a threat assessment would start immediately, and an MDR would be triggered after 10 days of a change in placement. A threat assessment, so after a student has been placed in a DAEP, the threat assessment would begin immediately after there's been a reported threat. Stephen, maybe you know if that could overlap with a DAEP placement.
So just in the interest of time, we'll just say one more thing about this question, then move on. It's very important to remember that MDRs and threat assessments are two different things. They can, of course, be related to the same incident, but they're two different things. And so when they happen and what purpose they serve, as Maya has explained, are really different. So how it would play out in any particular situation is difficult to say, but just keep that in general in mind, that they're two different procedures for two different purposes on different timelines. And I think we'll just go to our next question in the interest of time.
I've just added that to the chat.
Sure. So right now, with regard to our reference to new law on training requirements around crisis prevention and intervention, just to be clear, the state already does have, to some degree, a training requirement around restraints. It refers to training, though not a particular individual staff member, but to a quote core team. And so until all of the changes are implemented by HB2, the current requirements for training of a core team remain in place per TEA regulations. And ultimately, we'll see new proposed regulations about the training requirements and implementation of HB2 around crisis prevention and intervention.
And one more on that issue, and then we'll move on to ESA questions.
On the campus police element of crisis prevention, they should be included on crisis prevention and intervention if they are either an LEA officer or an official SRO, school resource officer, assigned to a school campus per a memorandum of understanding between the local police department and the school district.
Thank you, Stephen. So moving on to some ESA related, although these are not necessarily in order, sometimes people come in with their question about a previous thing you talked about. So here's a question about ESA.
So the question about why is there a lottery, that's a decision made by the legislature in SB2. The anticipation is that there will be more applicants than ESA accounts that are available in any year. Hence the process of a lottery to pick students who should have a better chance of getting an ESA compared to other students. That's a legislative policy choice.
Give me just a second. Okay. Here's one.
So a question about ESA and quote providers. So just to be clear, the Senate Bill 2 does have very detailed provisions about how an ESA account can be used by a participant. And while all the attention has been on private school tuition as being one of the uses of the ESA account, to be clear, there are other uses that are permitted. So once you have the ESA account, the family would choose an approved vendor for certain education related services if they did not spend all their money on tuition or in lieu of tuition wanted instead to spend money on a private provider. But please note that money in an ESA account can only be spent on an approved vendor who has been vetted by the state and is on the approved list.
Next question.
The next question is, when will we be able to apply for the ESA? That is to be determined. As we noted, because it's such a large program, the legislature delayed its availability to the 26-27 school year at the earliest, and there's no information yet about when applications will open.
The next question is about ESAs being used for other services.
As I noted, there's a range of allowed uses of the ESA account beyond private tuition, but there are very specific criteria for those other expenditures. But the bottom line is that the provider of that service has to be an approved vendor by the state.
So we're gonna go back a little bit to HB6.
Okay, so this question, before a student is removed, there still has to be a manifestation determination. So no, a manifestation determination review has to be done within 10 days of a student having a change in placement, and a teacher removal would happen immediately. So if the removal resulted in a change in placement, within 10 days, there would have to be a manifestation determination review, but that wouldn't happen before the student is removed from the classroom. What counts
as a removal?
As a removal, the child being removed from their regular classroom placement.
Okay, here's a question about school cameras in ISS rooms.
So this is a topic that we did not address specifically, but interesting to note, SB 568 does have some changes to our cameras in classroom law. I didn't review those because they're more technical in nature, but with regard to cameras in classrooms, there is a resource on the DRTX website, which I would point you to for a lot more information. But the bottom line is that cameras are only available in certain special ed classrooms and only when there's a request for those cameras. It's not automatic placement of cameras, and it does not go into every special ed setting. There are criteria. And again, I point you to our resource on the DRTX website for more information.
This, I think, is going back to a...
And by the way, Josh just posted into the chat that link to that resource on cameras in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. How this is going back, I think, to maybe the virtual settings.
Okay.
Saying that how does the state anticipate providing related services and co-teach in these settings? It seems unlikely.
So that would be a case-by-case basis. I do think that many services that students with IEPs receive would need to be given in an in-person setting. And so whether or not the school would, provide those services in person while a student is in a virtual expulsion program is going to be a case-by-case basis. And this is a new program, so there will be rulemaking that we'll be monitoring as well, but it's just hard to answer because every student's IEP is personalized and very different.
The next is just a helpful link that somebody sent. So we appreciate that from one of our participants. The next question is why only IDD addressed with regard to transition plan?
So just to be clear, is that the state has very specific transition planning requirements that go above and beyond what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires. And there are multiple elements of transition planning that are required once a student reaches the age of 14. The Hanley Act goes above and beyond those standard requirements for students with IDD, intellectual developmental disabilities. And that, again, that's just a policy choice by lawmakers this legislative session.
Okay, another question about transition planning. Person had a little bit of a problem with connection, wanted to know if there was changes to the law. It has additional questions. I do believe that there were a few changes, but can you see the questions that this person asked?
Sorry, I may have lost the full question.
So two agencies that are great
yes.
information.
I think this is in reference to in the Caitlin Hanley Act. It mandates that HHSC and TEA collaborate to create a resource on the LIDAs and the services that they provide. Will that be sent to the school districts? That will be sent to the school districts, so they can use that to share that information during that art committee meeting. And whether it's something you can access through your website, I anticipate that TEA will make that resource publicly available on their website once it's created. And you should be able to access it there, but it's unclear from the law, like if they're mandated to do that. Stephen, do you have anything to add?
Well, a couple of things. One is that oftentimes when new sort of notice or information requirements are added to the law, typically TEA is delegated the responsibility to create a model notice or model form so that the information is the same across the state, as opposed to asking each school district to come up with a new document themselves. So first of all, note that TEA is generally going to provide a sample form or document that will in turn be used by school districts when the time comes for that information to be provided. And as we noted in the interim session 2025 slide that Maia reviewed, there's so much new that TEA has to do as the next step. We don't have the information yet of what it will actually be provided, but eventually it will become available.
The next question is to the issue of personal devices.
So with regard to the cell phone ban bill, I assume this is in relationship to that. Again, that piece of legislation and new part of state law has its own definition of a personal communication device. It does not make any reference, as far as I'm aware, to a quote assistive technology device. But of course, depending on what that assistive technology device is, it may, essentially assume the meaning of a personal communication device. But most likely, if it's a device provided by the school district, it would not be considered a personal communication device for purposes of the cell phone ban.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. So I just want to point out we're right at 1 o'clock, and which is the official time we were to end this webinar. However, we are going to continue to try to answer as many more questions as we can for at least the next 10 minutes or so. So if you need to leave, we understand that. But if you're able to stay on for another few minutes to catch the answers to these questions, then please do. And of course, you will have access to our recording at the in a few days available to you as well in case you do need to hop off. So I'm sending the next one in.
Really quickly, before we get to that next question, I'm getting some messages that that resource on the Caitlin Hanley Act, the information about the LIDAs, is already available on the TEA website. And the link is already in the chat. It is in English and Spanish. And so just want to make sure folks know that they can find it there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maya. So question, virtual schools, if it's a private school, then the public school doesn't provide services. I'm not sure if I understand the question. Maybe I'll do.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, Edie?
It says virtual schools, if private school, ESA, then a public school doesn't provide services, correct? I'm not sure if I understand. It's in the chat.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but so let me just say this, with regard to Senate Bill 2, the ESA program, in general, the way it's going to work is that private schools have to register with the state and be approved by the state to allow ESA participants to use their account to pay for tuition at that school. So not all private schools are going to be getting ESA funds. And so whichever arrangement you are looking at, virtual, quote unquote, or hybrid or private, in person, regardless of the format or model, that entity has to be approved by the state. And then a parent can use the ESA account to pay for tuition at that entity. So that's kind of between the state and that private school. So whether or not they're in the program to be able to accept ESA funds.
Question, just a quick question about what was the bill number for the state plan for early special ed? I don't know if that was in the presentation.
It was, just a second, I'm sorry. That was HB 2310 on early learning and educational opportunities for young children with disabilities strategic plan, HB 2310.
Thank you, Stephen. Next question. You'll look in the chat for that.
Is this about SHARS?
Yeah, it does say SHARS at the top.
Okay, sure. So again, SHARS stands for School Health and Related Services. That's an acronym for the state program in which school districts can receive Medicaid reimbursement for certain services provided to students with disabilities. And again, the legislation just talks about at the administrative level who is running that program. The legislation designates Health and Human Services Commission, or HHSC, as the administrator of the program, with TEA in a supporting role only.
Next question is in the chat about about the change in the formal title of the school psychologist. Stephen?
Sure. Again, there was state legislation that affected the profession of licensed specialist in school psychology, or LSSPs as we know them. And it changed the title of their license to school psychologist.
Stephen, I think the question is, do they not have to be licensed anymore since that's not in the title?
Oh, great question. The change by the legislation is only to what we use as the term to refer to them. It does not change licensing requirements. It does not change continuing education requirements. It's just a change in the name of the title, and that is it.
The next question, I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. Going forward, I imagine that when a request for a student to have a personal communication device in their IEP or 504, the response will be no unless it meets the other two criteria. Any suggestions for a response?
Well, so just with regard to the cell phone bill, each of the three exceptions that we noted are independent exceptions. A school district or an art committee should not be saying, well, if we decide a student needs access to a personal communication device, the next step is go get a doctor's note. That would be incorrect or impermissible in our reading of the law. And there is some TEA documentation that does say that in policy guidance that is out now to school districts or will soon be out, that I would suggest you just cite to or point to, so that there's not confusion that it's a multiple step process. It's one exception and it stands alone as an exception.
Okay. Kind of a bigger question. Sounds like all these changes add up to no significant improvements to the overall quality of special education and service offerings in Texas. Correct? How would y'all respond to that?
Well, obviously, we always are striving to support and educate lawmakers on making improvements to the special ed system. I think that there are a lot of very important changes that we hope in the end will make things better and different for students with disabilities, from ensuring that resources more closely track their needs to enable school districts to provide quality special ed services, to providing crisis prevention and intervention training, to reduce the use of restraints, to having a person on a threat assessment team who knows a student with a disability. So I think in any particular situation, it's possible that we have made things better. The legislature has made things better for students with disabilities. But of course, can we always do more? I think that's our opinion. Yes, we're always going to be striving for even more broader improvements as well as specific situations that require reform.
Thank you, Stephen. Next question is about restraint. They understood that there was a 30-day timeline if not yet trained but used restraints. So wondering if the new legislation also changed the timeline or not.
With regard to retroactive training requirement, that is still current law. And I think we anticipate that that will remain the law after agency rule revisions.
So back to ESAs, we have a question. Once a family qualifies for a school voucher in a year, will they continue to qualify going forward, or will they have to apply for the lottery each year?
I will have to confess, I don't know 100% what the answer is to that question. It is in SB2. I'm assuming that, and well, let me just say this. I don't know for sure. I don't want to give a false impression of whether you remain eligible or you have to reapply. I honestly don't recall at this time what SB2 says about that. So sorry, we can't answer that question.
Yeah.
On the fly.
But we will make note of it. The next two questions are similar, so I'm going to just put it in this one. The person's confused if a student with a disability can apply for an ESA if they will still be going to a public school.
No. If you are a public school student, then you are not eligible for an ESA. That's true across the board, whether you're a student with a disability or not. The
Well,
ESA is only available for students who are not in public schools.
but if they want to, I'm wondering if they mean if the child wants to move to a private school, they can only use the ESA for private school. Is that right, Stephen?
So if instead the question is, I'm in public school now, can I apply in the hopes of them maybe moving out of the public school system? That's a different question and scenario. And the answer to that is yes, you can apply, but if you're approved, then you've got to de-enroll from public school.
Okay. I'm not sure if that's what they meant. I'm just trying to help. I think the other question might be if a student with a disability is in public school, can they have ESA funds to pay for other services? I'm not sure if maybe that's what they were getting at. We'll have to, I think that.
Yeah, so again, if the question is, can I stay as a public school student with a disability and still get an ESA? Then the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
There are parent-directed special education service funds that families of students with disabilities can use while they attend public schools to pay for some outside services, but that would not be the education savings account.
Another ESA question. You said priority for ESA would go to children who have not received ESAs before. I'm sorry. Does this mean if we received funds from PDSES in the past?
Sure. So
would we not be at the top of the list for the lottery, or does it mean we would not be eligible at all?
okay, sir. So just to be clear, and Maya just alluded to this, there is a separate state program that has undergone a title change. It used to be known as SSES. It's now PDSES for Parent Directed Special Ed Services, what PDSES stands for. Your participation in PDSES or SSES previously, I don't believe interferes with your ability to apply for the ESA or to be in the lottery for an ESA. That's my understanding under SB2. They're two separate programs. There is a little bit of a connection in terms of PDSES vendors can be also an ESA vendor, but that's a separate sort of level of participation in the program from a vendor standpoint, but it doesn't interfere with the parents or family's ability to apply or get in the lottery.
I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. It just says apart from the auto MDR, so I have requested it even if not triggered. Can y'all maybe decide what the question might be there? Not sure. Maybe they meant
So just to be clear, a manifestation determination review or MDR is something that you don't really request. It is a responsibility of the school district to conduct when the trigger for an MDR is reached, which is a change in placement, as that phrase is defined in special ed law. So a family, I guess, in theory, could ask for an MDR, sure, like anything else, but there's only the legal responsibility to conduct one is very narrow in the context of disciplinary removals and changes of placement.
Yes. So there is a question about pulling up the criteria for the ESA lottery slide and going back over that again. But before we do that, I think I might want to get to there was a question I thought was a really important question to answer. Accepting an ESA requires waiving rights under IDEA. Is that correct?
So to be clear, to participate in the ESA program starting next school year, meaning 2026, 2027, you cannot be in public school. And that means that you are giving up your IDEA and state special education rights. And we do have a resource. It's a very short resource, but we do have an initial resource on ESAs, by the way, I guess we should plug. That is on our DRTX website for helping families understand what we know now. And it's something I imagine we will be updating and expanding as next school year approaches. But we do have an ESA resource on the DRTX website now that we should point out for families.
Okay.
And that's now in the chat or the Q&A.
Right. So, can we go a few more minutes? We've only got a few left.
Sure.
Can we do it? Okay. Is there a preliminary? The person that wants the slide for the criteria, you will get a copy of this. So you will get that at a later time, just to let you know. Somebody asked, is there preliminary criteria for private schools to be approved to be an ESA fund recipient and provider of services?
So again, because of the complexity of the program and it being brand new in Texas, there's been this essentially 1-year delay so that everything can be, organized and hammered out and rules issued. I'm not sure we mentioned this, but actually there is already right now some proposed regulations that are pending for public comment by the Controller's Office on some parts of the ESA program. I don't believe they have to do with the criteria to get approved as a vendor. I'm sure that those will be coming and publicly available at some point. Of course, our interest is more focusing on how do students with disabilities participate in the ESA program rather than private schools participate in the ESA program. I would say I would refer you probably more to the ESA page on the controller's website for information about how private schools are going to participate as an approved vendor. We're not going to focus on that.
Didn't you already address if families have to reapply every year?
Well, that question came up and I basically said, I'm not 100% sure of the answer, so we're not going to give an answer. I apologize. And I still haven't had a chance to look.
Because a person did put in the questions, no students in good standing stay in the program automatically, but I don't know that they have to confirm that.
I would refer you to SB2 directly.
Yeah. So we don't know if that's actually correct, what the person has said. We need to look at more closely at the law. Okay. And then another person also said that ESAs can be used for other services while staying in public school. Is that correct, Stephen?
Again, ESAs are for private school students, if you will, homeschooled students.
Yeah.
You cannot be a public school student enrolled in public school or enrolled in a charter school for that matter and get an ESA or use an ESA, I should say.
Okay. I think we're going to have to go ahead and stop at this point. But we got all but about 3 things answered here. So we had 53 questions answered. So y'all are rock stars for sure. I'm going to just finalize by saying we just have a few next steps for you. We do have 3 new resources to help you with some of this on ESA, school discipline, and school safety. If you go to www.drtx.org/education, That's our education resource page, and those 3 are going to be featured at the top. Another thing you can do for next steps is subscribe to our education specific newsletter. If you'll go to www.drtx.org/subscribe, and you can subscribe for the education newsletter or for also our main newsletter. We just want to finally say that if you found this presentation and other resources we provide helpful, would you consider supporting us? If you just go to www.drtx.org/BTS donate, or you can just use your camera to take a picture of the QR code below, which will take you to that same URL. And I believe that is all. We just want to let you know that this is not meant to provide legal advice, for information purposes only, and the laws can change. But we do encourage you to seek specific legal help for your specific situation if you need that. And I think that ends our webinar. We thank you so much for your participation. At one point, we had nearly 150 people. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And we will be providing information about the slide deck and the recording to all the participants in the next few days. Thank you.